Some might think of veterans issues and national security issues separately, yet they are intricately intertwined. There's a moral imperative to take care of those who have put their lives on the line to defend us. There's also a national security imperative to do so. This fact raises several questions. How are America's veterans doing? How well are we taking care of those who have served our country in uniform? How can we do better? What are popular perceptions of veterans, and why does that matter? To discuss these questions and more, as well as some new research, I am joined by Marcus Ruzek and Navy Captain Dan Goldenberg. Marcus is Senior Program Director at the Marcus Foundation, which is a leader in philanthropy, specifically in the areas of military and veteran support. He has worked there at the foundation for over 10 years, supporting its free enterprise initiatives, national security and foreign policy, and free market ideals programs. An infantryman and combat veteran, Marcus deployed to both Afghanistan and Iraq. He commanded a Special Forces A-team, which partnered with the Kurdish Peshmerga in the fight against the Islamic State. Dan has led the Call of Duty Endowment, or CODE, since 2013. During his tenure there, CODE has become the largest philanthropic funder of veteran employment, backing more than 150,000 high-quality job placements and driving more than $9 billion in economic value for veterans and their families. He's a retired Navy captain. His military service includes 4 tours as a commanding officer, as well as a carrier-based naval flight officer and a special assistant to 4 secretaries of the Navy. He also has 2 decades of business experience. I am Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of FDD's Center on Military and Political Power, filling in for host Cliff May. We're so pleased you've decided to join the conversation too, here on Foreign Policy. Marcus and Dan, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
Same. Thanks for having us here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I thought maybe we could start maybe with you, Marcus, and just I just talked about your impressive military background. But I would just love to hear a little bit more why you've devoted so much of your life, your professional life, to helping veterans. Just kind of what is it in your heart or your experience that has helped you to make that important decision?
Yeah, thank you, Brad. I mean, look, it's incredibly personal. Obviously, I never thought it'd be anything but G.I. Joe, but it's a young man's game. You can't do it forever. I was fortunate to come directly out of the Army into the Marcus Foundation. So, Bernie Marcus, patriot, Air Force National Guard veteran himself, cares deeply for this community. And so to be able to, I got this incredible ramp from serving in the military and transitioning right into helping my community. And so Bernie made that possible. And, we've done a lot over the last decade and a half. But what we've always known in our heart, because Bernie also being a large supporter of national security, strong national defense, is that we've always had a concern that if our veterans are perceived as broken, as wounded, as damaged, that's going to hurt our national security. Yeah. And so we've always been very careful with our nonprofit organizations we support about the way they talk about their services. And so this study that we're going to discuss is really us trying to put numbers and data to this gut feeling that we've always felt. If people perceive our veterans as broken, then we're going to have a hard time encouraging the next generation to serve. So, look, I mean, we're incredibly passionate about it. We want to move forward on behalf of our veterans and our country in the best way possible.
No, thank you for that. That means a lot to me. I don't have the service you have, but when I worked in the Senate, I worked a fair amount on veterans issues. It hasn't been one of the top things I've worked on here, but all the while I've known that one, we have a moral obligation, as Abraham Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, to take care of those who've borne the burden on our behalf, but also that there's a national security reason to do it as well. So there's a moral reason and a national security reason. And that's why I'm so admiring of what you guys have done here and why I'm eager to talk about it. Dan, I mentioned your biography a little bit in my introductory remarks, but just retired Navy captain, 4 tours as a commanding officer, carrier-based naval flight officer, special assistant to 4 secretaries of the Navy. I'm wondering when you slept. I don't know, but
you left out the most important part: 4 kids.
Oh my gosh, yeah. That's the most important, right? Family. Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. But before we started recording, you just mentioned in our chit chat your family history, and I just found it so interesting. I'd love to hear just a quick Cliff Notes version of your amazing family history.
Two very interesting grandfathers. One, after the second pogrom of his village in Ukraine, he and his best friend walked to the Mediterranean, about 1,000 miles or so, walked Yeah, it's like the Goldenberg family version of the Odyssey, until they could raise enough money, and then they took a ship to what's now Israel, and he was a Chalutzim, or a pioneer in Israel, and was there till he got malaria and came to the U.S. about 100 years ago.
Wow.
And my other grandfather won 10 blocks of what's downtown Tampa today in a poker game, but then lost it a week later.
So in your genes is long walks and poker.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's good. Excellent. Okay. Well, no, thank you for sharing that. That's meaningful. Very meaningful. Thank you, Marcus. You mentioned the Marcus Foundation. I'd love to hear anything more you want to say about the important work of Marcus Foundation, and also Mission Roll Call, and one of the other organizations you're associated with or support.
Absolutely. So, Bernie's core passion and what we've wanted to focus on has been around healing the invisible wounds of war. So when you look at 20 years of war, this younger generation of veterans really struggle with things along the lines of post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, depression. And what we know is these are not forever diagnoses that they have to live with and be less than the rest of their life. There actually are ways to heal. And we just got to get them in front of the right program, in front of the right people, and provide them with the tools they need to continue serving. We want veterans to be the same productive members after service that they were on the battlefield. And the programs that Bernie has created, the Marcus Foundation has funded, the Avalon Action Alliance takes care of veterans and really does what they can to focus on these core issues. Now, Mission Roll Call, we started a few years later, and the reason was we needed this pillar. We needed an organization that could capture the military veteran voice and bring it to bear in Washington, D.C. and all over the country. Veteran policy is one of the oddest areas in policy in D.C., and the veteran voice holds a lot of sway. And so Mission Roll Call's job, and led by CEO Jim Whaley, is to put the megaphone in front of the veteran voice and ensure that it's heard across the country.
No, that's great. Thank you. Dan, you lead the Call of Duty Endowment. I'd love to hear a little bit about the important work you all do.
Yeah. So not surprisingly, it's in the name, inspired by the game Call of Duty. The leadership team at Activision Blizzard 15 years ago decided they wanted to give back in a meaningful way to the community that inspired the game. And thus was born the Call of Duty Endowment. And over time, we narrowed our model to really behave like a business. And that starts with, any successful business starts with focus. We focused on one issue, which was veteran employment. At the time, things were pretty dire, and the federal programs, the nonprofit programs, the corporate programs just weren't working very well. So we created this model to find and fund the highest performing nonprofits. And today, our latest numbers, we've placed through our funding over 149,000 vets and jobs. That's about 84% of the U.S. Marine Corps for a size comparison. And last year we did it 1/15.
The second best land force in the world.
We can debate that. I am a Navy guy, so I have a bias.
Think you're outnumbered. I don't know.
Team Navy Marine Corps. So we did it last year at 1/15 the cost of federal government efforts. And since 2022, we've actually placed more vets and jobs than the federal government has, which, again, we never set out to be the biggest, but our model is so effective. And it's because we find, we screen, we fund, we develop the highest performing nonprofits in the space, and we hold them accountable to results. And I think that's a theme you'll hear today
for sure.
About accountability. Accountability is the key to so much for really helping our veterans, but also ensuring the future of the all-volunteer force.
And what you just said will inform some of the policy recommendations we'll talk about here. But let me just foot stomp what you just said for the listeners: more than the U.S. government, more than the Department of Labor. So not too shabby of an accomplishment there, I'd say. That's pretty amazing. Okay, so we're about to dig into the research and survey that you've done, and then eventually the important policy recommendations. I think the answers you've provided up to this point give a little a signal onto the answer to this question. But I just why did you feel that you needed to do this research and have this survey?
Yeah. Quite frankly, we've been frustrated. Marcus drew my attention to an incredible statistic that the VA's budget, I don't know if it's the VA's budget or the federal veteran budget.
No, the VA's budget
alone.
Yeah. On 9/11 was about $40 billion. And today it's about $340 billion.
Wow. That's an 8x expansion in 20 years, 8 times. Where else do you see something like that? And the especially troubling thing about that is we haven't seen the results we'd expect from it. If you look at, just pick one issue, suicide, it's basically flatlined. We spend more and we do not get better results. It may be, in fact, it may have gotten worse. We're not sure about that, but you can replicate that effect across employment, housing, mental health, physical health. These programs aren't accountable, and that's really a problem because it's, after 20 years of war, it's kind of gotten into the zeitgeist that, hey, bad things happen to you after you serve. Yeah. And part of this is myth that needs to be debunked. And part of this is reality. We're just not, our programs taking care of veterans are just not effective. Yeah. And we have to do both. We have to address both. So that was the motivation for the study, is reveal the myths, and also reveal the problems with, helping better the veteran community. If we do both, we think the perception of veterans will improve, and therefore recruiting will improve. And the fundamental hypothesis, and I'll end on this note, the fundamental hypothesis of the study was 20 years of war has built up very negative perceptions of veterans that are hurting our recruiting and hurting the ability to maintain the all-volunteer force.
That's excellent.
If I can, Brad, real quick, just to add to that point, we've also, Dan and I have been working in the space over a decade, and we've become very frustrated with a lot of the veteran policy community. So,
absolutely.
And so part of this, that's the same community that took a budget from $40 billion to $340 billion, but the outcomes have not gotten better. They've gotten worse. And so part of this study also, if our hypothesis was correct, we now can take a community, the national security community, who does a better job, in our opinion, on moving policy, and get them to realize veteran issues are national security issues. So if we were right, that would open the door. And that's kind of why we're here today.
Excellent. Last contextual question before we dive in. Recruiting.
Yeah.
So what's happened lately on recruiting?
Yeah. So, talk about accountability or the lack thereof. Look, when we started this research, we took a look at Jammers, which is a DoD agency that, among other things, every year they do a study on the willingness to serve. And they've been doing it for 40 years. And very recently, we hit the lowest point in the willingness of youth. I believe it's 16 to 21 to serve in the military. The only time it's ever been this low before was during the surge in Iraq in 2007. So back then, and I don't mean to be crass, but when the public was seeing body bags coming home and seeing all the bad news coming out of Iraq, it's understandable with the willingness to serve. What's different? What's changed? Because that's not happening right now. And, the rationale we hear from DoD is the same stuff. It's the economy. Kids are out of shape. It's the samurai culture where only those who serve are only coming from military families. It's those kind of typical excuses. It's drug use, et cetera. But something's different. Something's changed. And we think there's this fundamental shift over 20 years of negative perceptions of veterans.
Yes. And some might, some people who have strong feelings about, Biden versus Trump might just say, haven't you seen the headlines about improved recruiting data lately? And then kind of dismiss the whole premise here. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, we'll see. Time will tell, right? It's a long term. There are plenty of things. It's not a straight line or a smooth curve. If you look at the Jammers data, it's up, down, up, down. But the dips were incredibly noticeable in 2007. I think the number I'm doing off the top of my head was down to 9%, something like only 9% were willing to serve. It's very, very rare for that number to go below 10%.
Yeah. And Dan said earlier, I think it's for the last 8 years, the Army Reserve has failed to read it. So
8 years in a row.
That's 8 years. Yeah, that's two administrations.
Exactly.
And the Army, regular Army itself, they missed their goal. They missed their goal again. They lowered their goal.
Right.
And they made that goal.
Right.
But they basically moved the goalpost and called it success. That's not okay.
Yeah.
And the Navy's, as a Navy guy, I just got to say, hasn't been so great either.
So serious Army problems recruiting for a long time. The Army's bigger than the Marine Corps. Yes, the Marine Corps has cooler uniforms and a better marketing campaign. I'm jealous.
I don't disagree with
join the Marines because you want to be a Marine. Join the Army because you get money for college. Which I don't know about. But yeah, there was some improved recruiting in 2024 before the presidential election. Sorry, Trump supporters. Let's get our facts right.
Yeah.
But it was for lowered goals. They met lowered goals. So I just think that's important.
You raise a good point too, that and about the Navy, they lowered their standards. That's never history has shown us that when the services lower their standards, there are bad consequences in terms of discipline and success. And the thing is, DoD has now bought a problem for the VA because those folks who are failing, who pass standards, they're going to more likely going to have problems with mental health and other areas for the rest of their lives, and the VA will have to support that.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so for some of our audience cares about methodology. I care about it. So give us, if you would, 60 seconds on the methodology for.
So we partnered with Ipsos on this data. Number one, they have a standing, statistically significant panel representative of America. So we tapped into that, but we also wanted to look at 3 additional groups. We wanted to look at that high school age potential recruit, right? Parents and educators. So we had statistically significant and representative groups in each of those areas that we were surveying. And you'll see as we talk through the data, or for those who go check out the study, you'll see. Hopefully, we can put a link to it on the site.
Sure.
But they'll see that the methodology was quite rigorous, as you'd expect from Ipsos.
Yeah. Okay. So let's dive in.
All right.
So however you want to take it. So you want to start the problems, or what you found, or I'll follow your lead.
So we found this. It kind of decomposes into 3 problems.
Okay.
The first is, we've already unpacked it a little bit.
Yeah.
A historical unwillingness to serve.
Yeah.
Historically low willingness to serve is another way.
Yeah.
Particularly, bad with either. The way it takes shape is asking the question, would you recommend military service? And more than half of Americans, say 55%, that no, they would not recommend military service to start off. Then you get the parents, and something like 2/3 of parents would not recommend military service. And when you get to teens, teen talking to another teen, very powerful influence group, 70% of them would not recommend service.
Yeah.
That's not great. There's a glint of hope here, is that more than half of educators would recommend service. And that's a theme we'll come back to later, I think.
Okay.
So, there's all kinds of problems with teens in this area, as you can imagine. One of the things that's not, we didn't talk in depth about it, but only half of high school students have been touched by military marketing. So half of them have never even seen a recruiter, an ad, anything like that. Only 25% of teens say they would ever even consider the military as a career.
Yeah. So, it just, it seems on an intuitive level, and if you're not exposed to something, you may not know it's an option. And my boss was the senior Republican on the readiness subcommittee for 6 years. And one of the things as part of that was BRAC, base realignment closure. I won't get too wonky, or we don't need to go down this cul-de-sac unless you want to, but the distinction between active, guard, and reserve. And when you have such a small percentage of Americans serving in the military, and you have large swaths of this country where there's no active duty military bases, it seems that might affect some of what you're talking about.
Yeah, look, there's a little bit of a vice here, right? That's closing, or maybe a better analogy, the funnel that's narrowing. Your exposure to it is diminishing, and the exposure you do have is not good, right?
Yeah.
And that actually is a great segue into the second problem area, which is poor perceptions of veteran outcomes.
Yeah.
And what this is, the interesting phenomenon we're really seeing, the top line of this is parents, teachers, students, they'll all stand up and cheer at a football game for a veteran. They'll donate to a cause. They say they admire veterans. But when you ask a parent or a teacher, would you want your kid, your player, your student to serve? They're like, oh, not my kid, right? Someone else's kid, it's fine. I admire them, but I don't want mine. Because if I do, something bad's going to happen to them. And, there was a lot of very interesting data here, but great fear of physical or mental harm through service. That more than half of Americans say veterans have difficulty reintegrating, and more than a third think they're unlikely to get a high quality job.
Yeah.
And the real kicker at the end was a third of them say they likely would regret their decision to serve in the military. So this is like a pretty negative view of it. And then more than half, 55%, thought they'd have some sort of mental illness after they left the service.
Right. So when we drill down and look at this, what we found is there's just a hard amount, a significant amount of misperceptions that are very pervasive. I mean, and much of that I think we'll get to kind of in the third problem area. But what we're actually, when you really look at veterans, the way I like to describe them is a little bit more of everything. Veterans are on average are more likely to start their own business. They are more civically engaged than non-veterans. They're higher educated than non-veterans. They vote at a higher rate. They volunteer at a higher rate. So like veterans, they do. But when you read these perceptions, you think they've all lost a limb, have a TBI, PTSD, and you don't want to hire them because they're maybe crazy, right? I mean, so those misperceptions are carrying the day when it comes to the veteran narrative, and that's really part of what's hurting.
And look, some of these are self-inflicted wounds. From Marcus and I representing the veteran serving organizations community. There's certain large nonprofits out there that have really dug into the broken, notion to fundraise. And it's a very effective fundraising tool, but it's terrible for the veteran community. And, it's the old, look, I'll give $10 a month. I just don't want to work next to this person. I'm afraid if they're in a cube next to me, they're going to go postal or something like that. I've heard those exact words.
Let me thank you for raising that. And I know we all have a heart here for all this, and you've dedicated your careers to it. How do we balance taking care of those that have seen and unseen wounds, and raising money for them, frankly, but also not having a negative, creating incorrect perceptions that affect recruiting and retention? How do you do that? It seems hard.
Yeah, I'll start.
You're the expert on this.
No, and this is at the core of what Bernie has always been concerned with. We don't want to shy away from the issues that our veterans are experiencing in transition, and ensure that they have the best care available to set them up. I think the best way to tell these stories, I have a very close friend of mine who, Green Beret, like me, Army Ranger qualified, served in multiple wars. The guy is a hero. He was the one top of the class, always expected to be a general officer. So it shocked everybody when he, after returning from Afghanistan, decided, no, I'm going to get out. I'm going to go back home and get a job. And he moved his family back to New Mexico, started working, did great for about a year, and then started to have significant anxiety, right? And they told him he had PTSD. He goes through a process of being overprescribed, 21 different medications in a period of 60 days, most of them like psychotropic drugs, etc. Ends up wanting to end his own life, etc. We get him in one of these programs we've started. He finally called me and told me he was struggling. And because of that, he began to live what we call post-traumatic growth. So everybody knows what PTSD is, but not a lot of people hear PTG. Post-traumatic growth is exactly what it sounds like. What doesn't kill you, it can make you stronger. Because of the struggle and the traumas and the pressure you've had in your life, you're actually a better person on the back end. Our veterans just need the training to be able to deal with that. And so my friend came through this programming. Today, he's now the president of the largest home building company in New Mexico. His family life is doing incredible, and he's back on track. And so that's the story we need to hear, right? I mean, we don't need to perpetually push around a veteran in a wheelchair to raise money for the wounded whatever project. What we really need to focus on is telling the stories that, there's some issues in transition. Let's address them. Like, the government's willing to spend $300+ billion a year on them. Let's address them, get them to the right program, and then let's talk about how great they continue to serve our country.
Maybe we could describe the great points. Maybe we could describe that as radical truth and transparency. That be truthful about what our fellow citizens have suffered defending us, help them to the best of our ability, and also be truthful about the so many positive outcomes of service.
Absolutely.
Is that a good way to say it?
Absolutely, right. I think it's well said. Maybe that should be the name of a bill.
One of my favorite hobbies when I worked in the Senate was not the title of the bill or the content of the bill, is coming up with a cool acronym. You had to come up with a cool acronym. For years, you'll think I'm joking, I wanted to have a bill where the acronym was Shazam, and I could never quite pull that. I never could quite pull that off.
We'll work on that for you.
Maybe my descendants will do that someday. Anyway, okay. Did we get to problem number 3? Let's go to problem
just one last thought there, which is, you just mentioned, like, there's some good stories to tell too. Like, radical truth here is a pretty good, because the bad stuff can be addressed, and there's so much good stuff, right? And the notion of DoD thinking of veterans as alumni is the right way to go. I almost wish we didn't have the term veteran. This notion that the best recruiters in the world for colleges are not college recruiters, it's alumni.
Yeah.
And colleges know this and they cultivate them and they work with them. They use them for interviews. Obviously, they do fundraising with them. But DoD's veterans are their export. When transition's over, they're done. It's a wrong way to think
rather
about
than
this.
an asset.
Yeah. Your best recruiters are not in a recruiting station. They're assets to you. And we need to think of the process of moving through the military and becoming a veteran more as a circular thing than a linear thing, right? Like veterans can be a great asset to help with recruiting. We don't leverage that at all. And there's some great stories to tell. So,
circular rather than linear. And I mentioned this in our roundtable that, many of the services.
Sorry if I stole that.
No, I do it all the time. I mean, as long as you cite your source. No,
cited.
Yeah. I'm sure I got it from someone else. I did. General McConville. General McConville, former Army Chief of Staff, who sat in this very seat, and we did an event with him, and was an important Army Chief of Staff, and served before that as G1. For those who don't know the alphabet soup of the Pentagon, that's in charge of Army personnel. And, a real focus with the Army is trying to create a lifetime of service where, maybe you start active duty and then maybe you go guard or reserve, then maybe you take a little time off, step away, then you come back. And when we need infantrymen, we need aviators, but we also need cyber folks. And maybe those career models look different. So, in addition to maybe a recruiting retention incentive for viewing veterans as not exports but assets, there's also that they might literally be coming back to service. So we better care about what happens to them after they leave Department of Defense, because they might be coming
exports. I like that.
Yeah, I'm borrowing from you. I'm
trademark it.
Yeah. Free of charge. Anyway, so
problem number 3.
Yeah, let's do it.
So everything we've talked to now has largely been about perception, right? Debunking false myths, how negative perceptions. We don't want to talk about reality here, because the story is not all, one of just changing information attitudes. There are some real issues veterans face that the federal programs that exist to help them are failing at. Almost 2/3 of Americans from the study feel that veterans are poorly supported by the federal government. And I think Marcus and I agree, they're not wrong. It's not about money. Again, like an 8x expansion of the federal budget, just the VA's budget alone, not the whole of government budget, is crazy, right?
Well, let me interject right here. You may not realize you're in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
You're inside the Beltway. And I think I heard you saying, and I almost fell out of my chair, that you don't need more money for this.
We do not need more money.
What?
We do not. I know.
Wait. Snap out of it, man. What's wrong with you?
During our whole calls today, some eyes rolled back in their head when we told them.
Oh, yeah.
No,
yeah.
It
depends what kind of office you were sitting in. I didn't say that.
No, I'm totally kidding.
Yeah.
But, and I'll give you some examples. There's Marcus and I can cover a couple of them, but I'll start with program by program. If we actually took a look and we held programs accountable, we could see that in many ways, federal programs are failing. I'll talk about employment. So again, the Call of Duty endowment last year placed more veterans than the Department of Labor did. And we did so for, I think, about $12 million. And we did it 1/15 the cost per placement. We've been doing that for a while with better quality outcomes in terms of starting salary, retention rates, and the percentage of those jobs that were for full-time employment. So high quality employment.
Wow.
That's just one example.
Yeah.
Marcus, maybe you could talk about some of the mental health and traumatic brain injury.
We'll talk about which is a huge buzzword in the VA world, right? Because invisible wounds are huge. The VA's mental health budget and suicide prevention is $17.1 billion now. For that, we're getting a flat or worsening suicide epidemic.
Yeah.
When you boil down veteran suicide, there's 3 leading causes. Major depression, often brought on by post-traumatic stress, substance abuse and addiction. A lot of people don't know this, but 70% of veterans who commit suicide are drunk or high when they do it. So it's a serious issue. And a lesser known major top 3 is missed or undiagnosed traumatic brain injuries. And these also, you don't have to go to combat to get a TBI in the military, right? A lot of service members are being exposed to blast waves and training, et cetera. Pilots with oxygen deprivation. I mean, it's across the service. So, but what we see is the VA doing a lot of these programming, many times with a geriatric bent. It's more about the stumble and fall. And look, that's what the VA is good at geriatric care. It's what they've been doing for decades. States. But when it comes to this injury, their programs are just not up to snuff. They have a few really good ones that actually are modeled after the programs we started, but it will only scratch the surface, and they can't handle the amount of throughput there. So we got to go deeper here, and the bottom line is we're getting 4x to 6x better outcomes clinically in our mental health programming, our TBI programming, than the VA or traditional mental health can offer. So look, if everyone's serious that veterans deserve the best care available, which I believe they are, then it's just not happening in the VA building. It's not happening in the government program.
Yeah. And so what we're saying is put these programs side by side, and the programs that are the most effective for $1 should win.
Right.
And you'll see that in our recommendations.
Yeah, I want to get to those real quickly. You've talked in the past about just the level of veteran suicide, and you have some numbers associated with that, and you put that in comparison in terms of casualties over the years of war. I'd love to hear you just kind of reiterate that if you're willing.
So the veteran suicide epidemic, what's reported on is around 20 veterans a day are taking their lives. So, when we look at every year in this country, we lose more veterans to suicide than we lost in the on the battlefield of 20-year war. So this has to be addressed. I mean, you think about, you never hear the CDC talking about veteran suicide. It's an epidemic. Yeah. What's also very frustrating is we worked with an organization that did a deep dive study into veteran death data. And the VA reports the suicide report every 2 years. So our numbers are always 2 years old, and it's based on the veterans they know and the data they have.
Yeah.
Veteran death data is reported at the county coroner level. So state to state, it's different. County to county, it can be different. This organization looked at 5 different states, went deep into the data, and found that on average, states underreport veteran deaths by 25%. And also overdose deaths are often not counted as suicides. If there's no note left, they're accidental deaths. I have a friend that we buried several years ago who, actually was starting to do better. He had struggled a lot. He was using different substances to help himself get to sleep. And one night he just did too much and it killed him. It was an accidental death. He's not one of the 20 a day, right? So, if we really go deep into these numbers, if we knew the real number, I think 20 a day would actually be a good day for veteran suicide, which is very upsetting. And so we got to do a better job. We need to be more transparent about what we're doing.
Yeah. You mentioned drugs and overdose, and if you don't have this data, no problem. I just can't resist asking. So many people outside the Beltway have wrestled in horrible ways with the fentanyl crisis, the precursor chemicals coming from China through Mexico, through our insecure border into our country, and so many have died as a result. To what degree have veterans been victimized or victims of fentanyl?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brett. I don't have the data in front of me. Yeah. It's something that came up in our roundtable yesterday. Yeah. We've got to look more into this because I'm confident that our adversaries are taking advantage of a veteran population, portion of it that's hurting, and using it to make us look weak.
So tens of thousands of Americans are dying because of the fentanyl crisis, and that includes veterans.
100%.
And these precursor chemicals are coming from China. We've asked them to stop it. They've resisted stopping it, and it's coming across our insecure border. So, to me, that just kind of underscores the national security. They're coming after those who have fought for our country. So it's just, to me, it kind of ties a lot of the national security elements.
One of the areas we found is Iran has actually produced content, put it online, targeting veterans who are struggling to click on X video, and it's actually it's war porn. It's showing them a bunch of gruesome videos and photos from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then shaming them, essentially saying they were baby killers, etc., trying to make them feel bad. So we've even seen our adversaries, Iran, targeting our veteran population, literally to.
I'm so glad
them.
You highlighted that, and Mark Montgomery, who leads our Center in Cyber Technology Innovation, and his has a expert, Max Lesser, and they've done a lot of work on information warfare, and we did our cognitive combat monograph, and I was honored to testify talking about how our adversaries are already engaged in information war against us, and you just highlighted an element of that related to veterans, and I'm glad you said that. All right, so back to you.
Yeah, no, okay. I think fundamentally, to kind of close out this area, it's a lack of accountability, right? It's staggering. I think the thing that frustrated Marcus and me so much, and some of our other colleagues, was that more and more is being spent on failing programs when there are better options available.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why does every year the Department of Labor gets the same amount of funding for their veteran employment programs, and they perform worse every year, but they keep getting the same amount of money? Why does that happen? It's an absolute waste. If the nonprofits we funded in this space got half the annual budget the Department of Labor devotes to this, they would wipe out veteran unemployment and underemployment, half. I mean, we should be doing this tomorrow. And so this is, if you look at each of these areas, this is why we're so focused on making this right.
That's great. So let's, that's a perfect segue if you're willing into your policy recommendations. You want to go through some of the policy recommendations?
Just wanted to hover on one thing real quick, which is, this isn't all Debbie Downer bad news. There's some, especially on the recruiting front, there's some lights. We identify, just as one example, school personnel are much more likely to talk about the military with high school age folks than their parents. In fact, 30 percentage points. So military service, about a quarter of parents will talk about it. 58% of educators will. So there's receptivity there. There's also a willingness from parents and teens themselves to learn about the veteran experience. So there's a window here opening up that they want to learn about it. The vast majority of them do. And the really interesting thing we learned, we asked everyone in the survey, true or false for 9 statements about veterans. Things like, true or false, veterans are less likely to own a home than a non-veteran. False, veterans are more likely to own. We asked 9 statements like that. The vast majority of folks, something like 2/3, got, or 3/4 actually, got almost more than 7 of those questions wrong. Then the really interesting thing, though, is the more they got right, the more likely they were to recommend service. And so educators with a proper understanding of the good outcomes for veterans are much more likely to be powerful influencers in recruiting. And I think we really underleveraged this year. So that's one of the things I would tell DOD, excuse me, is that you've got to focus on getting the truth about the veteran experience to educators. That will make a difference.
And parents,
absolutely,
and then take advantage.
The educators are more receptive. That's the difference. The parents are going to be a tougher nut to crack, but the educators are not. And it's easier to get to them, to really, to have that conversation.
That's great.
Yeah, it's really low-hanging fruit for a new DoD administration, right? I mean, who's facing a recruiting crisis. Here's an area where you can move the needle with very few resources and just some effort, right? And once we're going to talk through our recommendations, but one of those goes directly to this point, right?
Yeah. And again, we're not for a second saying we want more money. Quite the contrary, we don't.
Again, you're in the Beltway. What are you saying? Stop it, man.
I know.
Stop it. Snap out of it.
But it's interesting, like, despite all this, the American people, 90% of Americans, 90%. So where do you ever see 90% alignment on an issue? Say they'd like to see more government resources go towards veteran mental health and veteran employment. So there's a real willingness to do better here, which is the cool thing. So with that, we have 4 recommendations we'd love to discuss.
Please. Yeah, let's jump in. Go ahead.
So remember, I double-clicked pretty hard on accountability. So number 1, we think, is we need a veteran well-being dashboard where we're really taking the major programmatic areas right now. You remember when we pulled out of Afghanistan, who could forget? Secretary Austin did that press conference and some reporter asked them, hey, what about the veterans? And he said, the system will take care of it. And what's the problem with that? There's a lot of problems with that, but one of the big problems is there is no system. There's disparate programs that are not held accountable in mental health, physical health, education, employment, housing. And in most of those areas, the federal government doesn't even know how much they're spending in those areas. RAND recently did a study on them in this area, just on employment, and they came away very frustrated with the inability to actually figure out what the total spend is in the area. And then on top of that, you lump in, okay, well, what did we get for the spend? We have some sense in employment, but most areas we don't. So what we're asking for is, look, we want a dashboard. We want each of these program areas. We want to know exactly how much federal money is going into each of them, what their objectives are, what are the goals against those objectives, and how we're doing. Like, that is a perfectly reasonable request. And with that information, we'll be able to make better decisions about where to allocate funds.
Yeah. That's great. No, I know you have said in the past, and we know from maybe our military backgrounds, at least in the Army, I don't know about the Navy, but if something matters, you measure it, right? You measure it, as a Army aviator, I cared about helicopter maintenance, so I inspected the toolboxes. So you inspect that which matters, and it sounds like a lot of people are throwing around numbers and statistics, but those may not be correct because we don't have this kind of accountability dashboard that you're talking about.
Yep. Like bring it into the sunshine. I think people will be disturbed when they see the results, but it needs to be done.
Yeah.
So that's recommendation number one.
To use another Army saying, we would say, don't expect what you don't inspect. Right?
That's even better. I'm going to steal that one too. Yeah.
So, but that's what literally for 20 years, that's what we've been doing. We've been expecting the VA to take care of veterans, but there's been no accountability and transparency.
No. Yeah. And you used the cool word zeitgeist earlier. I mean, the kind of the zeitgeist of the moment, I don't love everything Doge is doing, right? The 4-letter word in some people's mind, but is there waste and opportunities for reform? Yes. And can't we all agree on understanding the truth of what the VA is doing well and not doing well and looking for better ways? Because can't we all rally around the following, that we want to take care of veterans and there might be better ways than the status quo to do it? Can't we all agree on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Anything else on number one before we want to go to number two?
I think that let's go number two. Okay. Look, I hope we've made the case that in many areas, nonprofit organizations are having far better outcomes for the dollar. The economic side of this matters, but most importantly, the effect on veterans. Mm-hmm. In many cases, there's some areas that are inherently governmental, and it's there's those government programs have to stay. Not that they can't get better, but there are many areas where we'd be better serving veterans and the taxpayer if we shifted funding to nonprofits. Yeah. So that's the second area. Like make these programs compete. Those who can ensure the best outcomes should win. And the standards should be strict. This is not a big tent approach. This is saying, look, we have strict standards. I'll give employment as an example, but you need to have been doing this for a minimum of 5 years. You need to have placed a minimum of 1,000 veterans. You need to be doing it for a minimum of under $1,000 cost per placement, which would be 1/12 of the government's cost. And you need to be getting certain quality outcomes in terms of retention rates and salaries. Right, that is perfectly fair and reasonable, and I truly believe the Face the Fight coalition, as an example, they found a way, a peer-reviewed, clinically evaluated way to measure the effectiveness of suicide prevention programs. Yeah, right. Everyone said it couldn't be done. How do you prove a negative? How do you prove you saved a life if someone didn't? They found a way to do it. It was hard, but that's a standard. They've raised the bar, and that bar should be met, and the VA should be required to do that. If they can't, others should take over that care, as an example. So that's the second area. The funds need to go to the programs that work the best at scale.
The recovering Senate staffer me is getting all excited here because this is just like, I know we have a lot of congressional staffers and members who listen to this podcast. I mean, this is not hard legislation to write. I mean, your average Senate staffer who has a boss on the Armed Services Committee or a House staff on the Armed Services Committee, Foreign Relations Committee, Veterans Committees, it's a reporting requirement to VA and or DOD about, we need this data and we need to show the effectiveness or lack thereof of respective programs. It's a reporting requirement. Yeah. It's written an unclassified reporting requirement because we know that we like to classify things that we don't need to be classified to hide them. Don't let them do that. Yeah. Right. So, we're literally writing legislation as we talk here. It's the authorization of a pilot program that maybe is a public-private partnership or maybe to establish some sort of public thing. That is held accountable to those established metrics of performance. Yeah. And then we judge. Judge, like, how does it perform? Put your money where your mouth is, as you guys are doing. And then, don't have the VA, as patriotic as they are and hardworking as they are, the great Americans there, judge the competition. No. Right. There's a place called the GAO, the Comptroller General. Yeah. So that Section 3 of this legislation, reporting, Section 1 is the reporting requirement. Section 2 is the authorization of a pilot program, perhaps public-private, certainly a private element. Section 3 is Comptroller General shall assess who wins. Yep. Right. Who wins? That's year number one. Year number two is the mandatory establishment of the private program, which your guys are predicting will beat the current existing public program.
Yeah. And it's a shame, Brad, because we really should have done this a decade ago. Yeah. This story is amazing. So 9/11, right? The budget for the VA is $40 billion. Yeah. We then go to war, and we don't just go to war and come home. We stay at war for 2 decades. Yeah. So what the private sector did, what philanthropy did, is an incredible thing. They saw all these gaps as our service members came home. And they filled them. They created programs. They did everything they could to show what right looks like and to take care of our warfighters. Well, the thinking there was at some point government will catch up, right, and ensure that this infrastructure to care for our veterans remains. And they certainly have the money to do it, but it hasn't, right?
Yeah.
And so why are we still 20 years later filling the same gaps that
Yes.
existed 20 years ago
Yeah.
with private philanthropy?
Yes.
Philanthropy can't sustain this forever. The problem's too big.
That's great. And everything I just said to the fiscal conservatives listening could be cost neutral. The offsets would be easy to identify within the existing VA budget. To the Democrats listening, we find a few things in the VA that you think could be reformed just to try to fund this thing. And to the Republicans who want to be stubborn on the cost neutrality, can't we afford a few $1 million to fund this pilot program? This is a compromise in 30 minutes between people of goodwill who are not focused on partisan politics and are truly focused both in word and deed on helping veterans.
Look, I spoke this morning to a severely wounded veteran who used oh my gosh, what's it called?
Voc Rehab.
Voc Rehab, a great program run by the VA to get an Ivy League education and a law degree. And he's now doing some very meaningful work. And he said everything was great until he had to find a job. And then when we went to the Department of Labor program, it was awful. And that's a consistent experience we've heard over and over again. Just go visit an America's Job Center and you'll know what we mean. It's like,
and that might be another source of offsets. I was focused on the VA. It might be the Department of Labor.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so,
like I said, half the money we can get the same
results. To Democrats, I'm not recommending a slash and burn. I'm saying, can we find something here that's underperforming and find a little money to fund something that we might find works a heck of a lot better at a lower cost? That's all I'm saying.
Absolutely.
Recommendation number 3. What do you got?
Yeah. You want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah. So we've talked about launching a national veteran awareness campaign. So one of the things that was great at our roundtable yesterday, was we have this incredible asset, like we've talked about, our alumni of the military. We send these Army recruiters, these Navy recruiters all over the country, in uniform, into schools, into everywhere. What we're saying, based on our data, is they're not always the best representative to make the pitch, right? Or the best person to convince people, hey, military service is good for you.
Yep.
And so we believe the veteran is an underutilized, underleveraged asset. Veterans, post 9/11 veterans, 90% of them want to volunteer to serve. They want to serve continually after their military service. And so let's put them to work. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't take much to have a veteran go into a school on Veterans Day and tell their story, right? Or just volunteer in the community and get to know young people and tell them why military service is worthwhile.
Yeah.
Those are the stories we want to perpetuate. And I think it would be it's a chip shot for the DoD to activate this network.
Yeah. And, if you think about it, just so everybody listening can identify, or almost everyone, I'm assuming most people listening went to college. If you went to college, you think about what influenced your decision to go there. Probably some alumni of that school had some influence on you, probably more than someone who works for the school. It's no different here, right? Somebody who's been through it and had a little life experience afterwards is incredibly credible. And this, this doesn't have to be, certainly they're professional athletes and actors and famous people, but there's also people who went from being, lower class economically when they were young to coming out of the military, becoming a professional, buying a house, raising a family, having a great life because of their military service. I'm someone like that. Yeah. I grew up relatively poor and, I think I was able to deliver a much better life for my kids than I had growing up. And it would never would have happened without the military. Yeah. And like these are the kind of stories we're talking about. We don't need superheroes. We need everyday people who had good outcomes in life. And there's a lot of us.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. And, and something, when you're a former staffer, and you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but some things don't need legislation. Some things might be as simple as the chief of the National Guard Bureau saying to all their 50 state tags plus the others that I want you in your state or territory to identify every school and reach out to them, Ohio National Guard, Indiana National Guard, and offer to send a representative from the nearest by unit to the school near Veterans Day. and make the offer to every one of them and let them say no.
Look, I live in True Blue, California.
I could write that memo for the National Guard Bureau in about 30 seconds. And oh my gosh, what an important potential component as a practical step on this awareness campaign, because some recruiters are great. They're working hard. They have a tough mission, but sometimes there's someone who might be a better spokesperson.
And my experience has been there's a real willingness on the schools part too. Like I said, I live in True Blue, California, and our school superintendent reached out and asked if any veterans would like to come and speak. Which was incredible, right? And we did, and it was wonderful. And there's opportunities out there. Our data shows that there's a real appetite to hear about the veteran experience. But the Army and the Guard should create an ambassador program. Call it what you want, where they, some minimum level of training where we have people not saying stupid stuff, but essentially talking about their positive experiences. It'll do a world of good.
And the last thing I'll say on this, and I'm eager to hear number 4 from you, is, and I mentioned this during our roundtables, that H.R. McMaster, another veteran who's chair of our Center on Military and Political Power here and a mentor and a friend to me, wrote an important piece in National Review called Preserving the Warrior Ethos on October 28, 2021. So anyone listening interested in these issues, I really commend that article to you. And it's getting one of the key ideas there, and HR says it so much better than I can, that there's so many that our country is worth defending, and defending is a thing of pride, and you're part of something bigger than yourselves. And there's so many benefits to that change you in positive ways forever. So I think being informed by those kind of ideas could be an important part of this awareness campaign you're talking about.
Agree completely.
Yeah. Look, I mean, like, I think of Dan and I, we served our country. We've gone on to continue serving in different ways. Patriotic. We love this country. And we want to see a strong future for our kids and for everybody. And we're not unique in this respect, right? Yes. This is ubiquitous across the veteran population.
Yeah. I mean, even during COVID, when a lot of active duty medics and corpsmen, Air Force med techs were being asked to go out in the civilian community to help, the DoD asked for volunteers, and they had more than 10,000. Army had more than 10,000 former medics and corpsmen who volunteered to come on base and help backfill them. I mean, there's this hunger to help and be involved. It's just, look, service attracts people with that ethos, and we should take advantage of it.
Yeah, for sure. Number 4. What's number 4?
Final area. This one's pretty easy. The study makes it super clear that educators are great. Engaging educators is a great opportunity to help these efforts. I have yet to see any major efforts out of DoD to do that in recruiting. And, there's a willingness, there's a receptivity, there's scale there. And, it's very clear the more facts they know about veteran outcomes, the more likely they are to recommend military service. And this is, teachers, coaches, administrators. Yeah. So real simple. The advice is you must engage educators with, a campaign about the truth of positive veteran outcomes.
Yeah. So to your point earlier, we don't have to pass a law to get this one done. No. So if we've got any DoD officials that are listening that would want some low hanging fruit to fight this recruiting crisis, this one's easy, man.
I agree.
You can get there.
For sure. Well, you guys were if you don't mind me saying so, you were on the Hill today talking about these same things in multiple meetings, an impressive agenda it looks like you guys had. You need to.
We have 9 in total or something.
You're going to sleep well tonight. You've earned your pay today. What was the reception you got? How did you feel about the reception you received from the members and staff?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I mean, I think that what was a common theme was, this is kind of fresh air. Like, we're frustrated for different reasons around these issues, and we haven't really heard it framed in this way. And that was totally our goal. I mean, we wanted to show people, hey, if you're in the national security community and working on those committees, you think, I do this and VA does that, and I can't really meddle with VA, and sometimes VA hurts me in my mission. What we're trying to say is, no, veteran outcomes and what the VA is doing is your business because it's national security. And then likewise, if you're on a veteran committee or you're working in the veteran kind of sphere, they should jump all over this from the standpoint of, hey, not only are you just taking care of veterans, no, what you are doing is a national security mission. And so I think there was fresh air. That was one of my first encouraging.
I agree. And, to your point earlier, Brad, like, we're not asking for more money. We're really not. In fact,
we
hopefully would save a lot of money.
Exactly.
So that's fresh air as well. I think we've got work to do to figure out the how. But I like this. the outline you put forth
Yeah.
for legislation is a really smart one.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to start. I still am baffled that bad behavior is continuously rewarded with these veteran programs, where, despite failing over and over again, the budgets remain the same or increase. That shows to me a real lack of oversight. And I think it's time for the national security establishment to get involved with these veteran programs, because going back to the metaphor earlier, it's not really linear, it's circular, right? That, these exports veterans, they actually they influence our ability to bring people in the front end.
That's right.
And there was a chairman of the Joint Chiefs I won't mention several years ago, who after he on his first week on the job disestablished the Chairman's Office of Reintegration, which was a very small, incredibly effective organization in the Pentagon that helped connect effective veteran programs with DoD. I'd love to see that come back, and I think folks on the Hill would as well. This chairman said, transition is not my mission, and he couldn't have been more short-sighted or wrong, right? Like, is your mission not to maintain the integrity of the all-volunteer force? Because if it is, you have to hear about veteran outcomes. And I think there's an understanding amongst us still Hill staffers that I don't necessarily see in the Pentagon.
Yeah. And on their reception too, there was a willingness to connect us across the board. So they want to help solve the problem. So I'm really happy with who we were able to speak with today. And there's a lot more work to do. As what often happens probably.
That's encouraging and overwhelming. There's nothing better than work worth doing. So that's wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both sincerely for your military service. Those aren't flippant words for me. I really mean it. You both raised your right hands and deployed forward to stand between those who wish us ill and us here at home. So thank you for that. Thank you for your genuine heart for veterans, both in your military service and what you've done with your veterans. You're putting your money where your mouth is, and I respect that. I really appreciate what the clear message that I think you're saying here is that we have both a moral imperative to take care of our veterans and a national security reason to do it. What we have here as a country is exceptional, I would say. It's extraordinary. It's amazing. It's worth defending. And if we're going to defend it, we have to have some of our best citizens be willing to join the military and stay in the military. And that's another reason why these things matter. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your service. And thanks to our listeners for joining us here on another episode of Foreign Pods.